it's good we begin with Surah Al-Fatiha. Bismillahir Rahmanir Rahim, Alhamdulillahi Rabbil Alameen, Ar-Rahmanir Rahim, Maliki Yawmiddin, Iyyaka na'budu wa iyyaka nasta'een, Ihdina as-sirata al-mustaqim, sirata alladhina an'amta alayhim, ghayril maghdubi alayhim waladdallin. Sadaqallahu al-aliyyul azim. A'udhu billahi as-sami'il alim minash shaitanir rajim. Bismillahir Rahmanir Rahim. Alhamdulillahi Rabbil Alameen, wa sallallahu ala Sayyidina Muhammad wa ala ali baytihi at-tayyibin at-tahirin. ولعن الله على أعدائهم أجمعين من الأولين والآخرين آمين يا رب العالمين أما بعد السلام عليكم ورحمة الله. So tonight we begin with neither a verse of the Quran nor a hadith of the Imams, but with something rarer. We begin with a letter written in the hand of the 12th Imam, may God hasten his return and may our souls be his ransom, delivered through his final deputy, Ali ibn Muhammad al-Samari, in the year 329 after Hijrah. It is the last direct communication from the living Imam to his community, and in it, one sentence changed everything. It reads, and of course the references for all of these are in the write-up. The Imam writes, "As for the newly occurring events, refer regarding them to the narrators of our hadith, or our traditions, for they are my proof upon you, and I am the proof of God upon them." Think about the architecture of this sentence. The Imam doesn't say, "Wait for me." He doesn't say, "The doors are closed, go and fend for yourselves." He says, "Refer to the narrators of our hadith or our tradition," meaning go to the scholars who carry our word. And then he raises them to a station that no political appointment, no royal decree, no worldly authority could ever confer, saying, "They are my proof upon you." The scholars are the Imam's proof, and the Imam is God's proof upon them. This single sentence is the constitutional charter of the institution of Marja'iyyah. Everything we will study tonight and in every session that follows in this series flows from this. So firstly, imagine if you can, the year 329 after Hijrah. For 70 years, the span of an entire human life, the Shia had lived with a very thin lifeline. The Imam was hidden, yes, but he was not silent. Through 4 successive special deputies, letters came, questions were answered, guidance was given, disputes were settled. The community could not see its Imam, but it could still hear him, it could still communicate with him. And then, in that year, the final letter arrived. And the final letter said, "The door is closed." I'll read you a portion of it. It says, and the reference is, like always, in the write-up, "The complete occultation has now occurred. There shall be no appearance except by the permission of God, exalted be his mention, and that shall be after a long and lengthy period, and the hardening of hearts, and the earth being filled with injustice. And there shall come to my Shi'a those who claim to have seen me. Behold, whoever claims to have seen me before the rising of the Sufyani and the heavenly cry, he is a liar and a fabricator, and there is no power and no strength except through God, the Most High and the Most Great." No more letters, no more special deputies, no more lifeline. Now what? This is not a rhetorical question. This is the most serious crisis any religious community has ever faced. Because the Shia are not simply a community that reveres a historical figure, the entire architecture of Shi'ism, its theology, its law, its spirituality, is built on the premise of a living, present, accessible Imam. If you remove that access, what remains? A collection of memories, perhaps? A library of texts? A community slowly drifting apart, as communities do when the center no longer holds. The answer and the subject of tonight's session is that what remained was not drift. What remained was construction. Because the Imam, in his final communication, the Tawqi that we just heard, did not leave the community without direction. He pointed them to the scholars, and the scholars understood. If we do not act now, if we do not gather, compile, preserve, and transmit everything that the Imam taught us, then the light will not merely be hidden, it will be lost. Tonight, we meet the men who ensured it was not lost. Please give me a salawat and we'll have a very brief recap of the previous session. So in our previous session, which was titled The University of al-Saduq, 4,000 students and a living Imam, we stood in the classroom of Imam Ja'far al-Sadiq, peace and blessings be upon him. We saw the fountainhead, 4,000 students, a curriculum that ranged from jurisprudence to chemistry, a circle so vast that even the founders of the four schools of the Brothers of the Sunnah drank from it. We honored those schools, the Hanafi, the Maliki, the Shafi'i and the Hanbali, as branches from the same tree. And we were careful to distinguish that the Hanbali school of Imam Ahmad ibn Hanbal, the man who was imprisoned and flogged rather than compromise his beliefs, from the later Wahhabi deviation that claimed his name while demolishing the graves of Ahlul Bayt and declaring the vast majority of Muslims to be heretics and polytheists. A school must be judged by its founder and its mainstream tradition, not by the most extreme offspring that it has. And then we trace the darkness that followed, the Abbasid betrayal, the systematic poisoning and imprisonment of the Imams, the escalating persecution that made the occultation both a divine mercy and an existential crisis. And the session ended at the threshold. Tonight, God willing, we cross it. If the University of al-Sadiq was about what the Imam built, tonight is about what happened when the builder was hidden and the students had to become builders themselves. Please give me a salawat and we move to the first point, which is the codification race, Shaykh al-Kulayni and the compiling of Al-Kafi. In the village of Kulayn, a small settlement near Ray, south of what is today's Tehran, a boy was born who would grow up to save a civilization's memory. His name was Abu Ja'far Muhammad ibn Ya'qub, Muhammad the son of Ya'qub. History knows him as Shaykh al-Kulayni, which means simply the one from Kulayn. It is one of the humilities of this tradition that its greatest compiler is named not after a title or a dynasty, but after a village that most people neither knew existed nor had ever heard of. Shaykh al-Kulayni rose to become the religious leader of the Shia in Ray, a major center of learning in its own right. This is the area south of Tehran. And later he migrated to Baghdad, the capital of the Abbasid Caliphate, and the most intellectually vibrant city in the world at that time. The great biographical scholar An-Najashi describes him as the most meticulous and trustworthy person of his time in the narration of hadith. Najashi says in his well-known book, which is titled Rijal Najashi, which is a compendium of biographies of people who transmitted hadith and recorded such things. Najashi says about Shaykh al-Kulayni, the most reliable of people in hadith and the most precise among them. That's what he gets called. And here is the detail that frames everything. Shaykh al-Kulayni was born around the year 250 after Hijrah, approximately a decade or so, roughly a decade before the Minor Occultation began. He lived through the entire 70 years of the Minor Occultation. His entire adult life was spent watching the connection to the Imam grow thinner and thinner, from direct deputyship to fewer letters to silence. He knew what was coming, and he responded the only way a scholar can respond. He wrote. Now, to understand what Shaykh al-Kulayni did, we must first understand what he was trying to save. For 2 centuries, the companions of the Imams, men like Zurara ibn Ayyan, Muhammad bin Muslim, Abu Basir, and etc., and others that we've mentioned in previous sessions, had been recording what they heard from the Imams. These personal notebooks were called the 400 Principles. They were not books in the modern sense. They were handwritten records, individual scrolls, kept by individual companions and passed down through their families and students. You could say they were written on like small like napkins or small pieces of paper, and they were just kept by people. By Shaykh al-Kulayni's time, these notebooks were scattered all across Qom, Kufa, Baghdad, Ray, and other places. Some were in private collections, some were disintegrating and deteriorating. Some were in the hands of families who did not fully understand their significance. And the men who could verify them, the living links to the Imam, were dying one generation after another. Without compilation, this treasure would not survive. Not because anyone would deliberately go about destroying it, but because time itself is a fire and unorganized knowledge is kindling. Shaykh al-Kulayni's response was Al-Kafi, a title that means the sufficient. Not the complete, not the encyclopedic, just the sufficient. And there is a wisdom embedded in that name. He was not trying to record everything. He was trying to record enough. Enough for the community to function, to worship, to govern its affairs, to understand its theology, to maintain its identity in the absence of a living and accessible Imam. He spent 20 years compiling this work in Baghdad. 20 years of gathering, verifying, classifying, and organizing over 16,000 narrations into a coherent structure organized by subject. The book is divided into 3 key sections. The first, Usul al-Kafi, which deals with the foundations: theology, the nature of God, the proof of imamah, knowledge and ignorance, faith and disbelief. The second is called Furu al-Kafi, which addresses practical law, prayer, fasting, pilgrimage, marriage, commerce, inheritance, and so on. And the third is Rawdat al-Kafi, which is a collection of miscellaneous narrations, letters, and speeches from the Imams. In his introduction, Shaykh al-Kulayni preserved the request that set him on this journey, the words of an unnamed fellow believer who saw the community's need and came to him with a plea. Shaykh al-Kulayni writes, and this is in the introduction of Kitab al-Kafi, the book of Kafi. He writes, "You said that you wish to have a sufficient book, one that gathers all the branches of knowledge of religion, that which suffices the learner, that which the seeker of guidance may turn to, and from which the one who desires the knowledge of religion and wishes to act upon it may draw, through authentic narrations from the truthful ones, peace and blessings be upon them, and the established practices upon which action is based, and through which the obligations of God, the mighty and majestic, and the sunnah of his prophet, peace and blessings be upon him, his family and righteous companions, are fulfilled." The reference is in the write-up. Think about what's being asked for. Not a book of theory, not a book for specialists, a book that suffices the learner, a book that the seeker of guidance may turn to, a book from which an ordinary believer, far from Medina, far from the Imams, far from anyone who could answer his questions with certainty, could draw what he needed in order to fulfill his obligations to God and to the sunnah of the Prophet, the tradition of the Prophet. This was not an academic commission. This was a cry for help. And Shaykh al-Kulayni heard it. And when the work was done, 20 years later, 16,000 narrations later, a lifetime of verification and classification later, Shaykh al-Kulayni responded with words that carry both the humility of a servant and the resolve of a builder. He said, and this is again from the introduction of Al-Kafi and the references in the write-up, he said, Shaykh al-Kulayni said, "God, and to him belongs all praise, has facilitated the compilation of what you requested. I hope that it is as you had wished, and whatever shortcoming there may be in it, our intention in offering sincere counsel has not fallen short. For such counsel is an obligation to our brethren and the people of our faith." Think about that one line. Whatever shortcoming there may be in it, our intention has not fallen short. This is a man who spent 20 years on a single book, and he still presents it with the humility of one who knows that no human effort can fully capture what the Imams poured out. He does not claim perfection. He claims sincerity. And he frames the entire enterprise not as some sort of personal achievement, but rather as an obligation, a duty. He says, an obligation to our brethren and people of our faith. This is the voice of Shaykh al-Kulayni, not a scholar seeking fame or wanting to be a celebrity. This is a servant fulfilling his duty. A man who heard a community crying out for guidance and spent the best years of his life answering that cry. The scholars who came after Shaykh al-Kulayni understood what he had done. Shaykh al-Mufid, who we're going to meet in a future session, called Al-Kafi the following. He said, "The book Al-Kafi is among the most magnificent of the books of the Shi'a and the most beneficial of them." And the references in the write-up. And Shahid Awwal, the first martyr, Muhammad ibn Makki, who himself, we'll also meet him later, who himself would write one of the House's most enduring textbooks, Al-Lum'at al-Dimashqiyya, from a prison cell in Damascus, said of Al-Kafi, "The book Al-Kafi in Hadith, the like of which has not been produced for the Imamiyyah." The reference again is in the write-up. These are not casual endorsements. These are the greatest minds of Islam, of Shi'ism, a theologian and a martyr, testifying that what Shaykh al-Kulayni had built was without precedent. And Shaykh al-Kulayni was not working in isolation. Across the Muslim world, the same urgency was driving the same project. Our brethren of the Sunnah were engaged in their own monumental effort to codify the prophetic tradition. Sahih al-Bukhari had been compiled a generation earlier in 256 after Hijrah. Sahih Muslim followed in 261 after Hijrah. And the collections of Abu Dawood, At-Tirmidhi, and Nasa'i, and Ibn Majah, which are all the major collections of our brothers of the Sunnah, were all compiled in the same century. The entire Ummah, both Shia and Sunnah, were racing against time, driven by the same fear that what was not written would be lost. But the Shia had an additional urgency that our respected brothers and the compilers of the Sunnah did not. The Sunni tradition was losing its narrators, yes, the human chains connecting them to the Prophet. The Shia, however, were losing something far more significant. They were losing the Imam himself. For a community whose entire theology, law, and spiritual life followed from a living, divinely guided leader, the occultation was not merely an inconvenience, it was an existential crisis. And Shaykh al-Kulayni knew, as perhaps no one else did, that the crisis demanded a book, but a sufficient book, not just any old book, a sufficient book. A book that would carry the community through an absence whose duration no one could predict. And here's the detail that once you hear it, you cannot unhear it. Shaykh al-Kulayni died in the year 329 after Hijrah. 329 after Hijrah. The very year that Ali ibn Muhammad al-Samari, the fourth and final deputy, received the Tawqi that we heard earlier at the start of this session, the letter that announced the complete occultation. The very year the door closed. Shaykh al-Kulayni finished his life's work and then he passed on. At the exact moment the community would need his work the most. It's almost as if God timed his mission. Compile the book, complete the book, and then depart. Because the book must now do what the deputy could no longer do. Ensure that the voice of the Imams was never silenced, even when the Imam was hidden. He was buried in Baghdad at a place called Bab al-Kufa, the gate of Kufa, as if even in death he stood at the threshold between two cities, two eras, and two worlds. Now the lessons for our time, three things that we should carry from Shaykh al-Kulayni tonight. Firstly, he did not wait for the perfect conditions. Baghdad under the Abbasids was not a safe place to be a Shia scholar, compiling the words of the Imams. The political environment was extremely hostile. The resources were limited. The task was monumental. But he did it anyway for 20 years. In our age, we have tools that Shaykh al-Kulayni could not have even imagined. Digital archives, printing presses, the internet, artificial intelligence, and so on. The question is not whether we have the means to preserve and transmit knowledge. The question is whether we have the will. Second, the name Al-Kafi, the sufficient, carries a lesson in itself. He did not try to record everything. He tried to record enough. In an age of information overload, where we're drowning in content but starving for substance, the discipline of sufficiency, of knowing what is essential and organizing it with care, is by itself a form of wisdom. And third, every builder has a window. Shaykh al-Kulayni's window was the Minor Occultation, 70 years in which the last living links to the Imams could still be traced, the last notebooks could still be gathered, and the last narrators could still be questioned. He used every year of that window, and when the window closed, the book was ready. The question for us is, what window are we in? And what are we building before it closes? Please give me a loud salawat. We move to point 2, which is Shaykh al-Saduq, the traveler who fought doubt. So before we speak of the scholar, we must speak of how he came to exist, because the story of his birth itself is a proof. His father was named Ali ibn al-Husayn ibn Musa ibn Mahdawiyyah al-Qummi, a respected scholar in his own right, based in the city of Qom, the heartland of Shia learning in Iran. Ali ibn Mahdawiyyah was a contemporary of the Minor Occultation. A respected scholar, like I said, he lived through the era of the Deputies and he had access to them. And he had a request. He wrote through Abu Ja'far Muhammad ibn Ali al-Aswad, who we mentioned when we spoke about the third deputy, Hussein ibn Ruh al-Nawbakhti. And he asked him to convey a petition to the Hidden Imam, saying, "Pray for me that God grant me a son." The reply came back from the Imam in a Tawqi, and it says, "We have prayed to God for this on your behalf, and you shall be granted 2 blessed sons." And this is, the reference of course is in the write-up. 2 sons were born, Abu Ja'far Muhammad, who is Shaykh al-Saduq, and his brother Abu Abdullah al-Hussein, who was also a scholar of hadith and jurisprudence. And Shaykh al-Saduq himself, for his entire life, took pride in this origin. His brother Hussein reported, "I was born by the supplication of the Master of the Age," and he, meaning Shaykh al-Saduq, used to take pride in this. The reference, of course, is in the write-up. Think about what this means. This is not just some random biographical detail. It is a theological statement. The Hidden Imam, the same Imam who had just sent the Tawqi that we heard at the start of today's session, delegating authority to the scholars, prayed for this child to be born. The scholar who would become the greatest hadith compiler of his generation was, in the Shia understanding, a direct answer to the Imam's supplication. The chain we traced in our 2 sessions ago, session 61, from the Imam to the scholars, is not merely institutional. It is personal, it is providential. The Imam prayed and the compiler was born. Now his full name was Abu Ja'far Muhammad ibn Ali ibn al-Husayn ibn Musa ibn Mahdawiyyah al-Qummi, but history knows him simply as Shaykh al-Saduq, the truthful. This was not a family name, neither was it inherited. It was earned through a lifetime of such meticulous honesty in the transmission of hadith that his contemporaries and successors agreed, this man does not lie. What he narrates faithfully. What he transmits exactly as he received it. In an age when the temptation to fabricate hadith was real, when political factions, theological schools, and ambitious individuals all had reasons to put words into the mouths of the Imams, as we've learnt in previous sessions, Shaykh al-Saduq's reputation for absolute truthfulness was not merely admirable, it was essential. Without men like him, the entire hadith corpus would have collapsed under the weight of fabrication. He was born after the year 305 AH, during the deputyship of Hussein ibn Ruh, the third deputy. And he died in 381 after Hijrah in the city of Ray, which is, as I've said, in the southern part of modern-day Tehran, where he's buried near the shrine of Shah Abdul Azim al-Hassani, which is the famous Shah Abdul Azim shrine in Tehran, in Shahrari. His life then spanned the transition from the minor occultation into the first half century of the major occultation. He was a man of the threshold, born in the last years of the lifeline and spending his adult life in the silence that followed. Now, Shaykh al-Kulayni's crisis, as we saw in the previous point, was the scattering of the hadith. The notebooks were dispersed. Without compilation, they would be lost. Shaykh al-Saduq faced a different crisis, a far deeper one. The hadith were being compiled. Shaykh al-Kulayni had seen to that. But the community itself was fracturing. Not over law, not over ritual, but over the most fundamental question of all. Is the Imam really there? The major occultation, of course, had begun. The deputies were gone. No more letters, no more confirmation. And in the far-flung communities of the Shia world, in places like Nishapur, in Balkh, in Samarkand, and in some of the remote towns of Central Asia, ordinary believers were asking a question that no hadith compilation could answer by itself. Questions such as, how do we know this is real? How do we know the Imam exists? How do we know we are not following a doctrine that died with the last deputy? Shaykh al-Saduq knew this because he went to them. He did not sit in Qom and write. He travelled, more extensively than perhaps any Shia scholar of his era. The biographical sources record the scale of his journeys, and they are extraordinary. Qom to Ray, Ray to Mashhad, Mashhad to Balkh, Balkh to Samarkand, Samarkand to Fergana in what is today's southeastern Uzbekistan, then to Iraq, which is near present-day Tashkent, then back through Nishapur, then to Kufa, and then to Baghdad, where he met the young Shaykh al-Mufid, who we're going to be, inshallah, studying in a future session, then to Mecca for Hajj. He went to the edges of what was known as the Shia world, and what he found there alarmed him. In his introduction to his well-known book, Kamal ad-Din wa Tamam al-Ni'mah, The Perfection of Religion and the Completion of Divine Grace, he explicitly states that he travelled to Nishapur and found the Shia there deeply troubled about the occultation. They were questioning whether the Imam was truly alive. They were questioning whether the doctrine was real. This was not abstract theological doubt. This was an existential crisis, the kind that empties mosques and dissolves communities. If the Imam is not there, then what are we? If the chain is broken, then who are we following? And if no one can answer these questions, then perhaps we have been wrong all along. Shaykh al-Saduq's response was not to dismiss the doubters. It was to address their doubt with the most powerful tools available to him, rational argument and historical precedent. The book Kamal ad-Din wa Tamam al-Ni'mah, The Perfection of Religion and the Completion of Divine Grace, is Shaykh al-Saduq's theological masterpiece. It is not a hadith compilation in the conventional sense. It is an argument, a sustained, systematic argument that the occultation of the 12th Imam is neither unprecedented nor is it irrational. His method was brilliant in its simplicity. He turned to the Quran itself and to the shared heritage of all the Abrahamic faiths, and he asked, has God ever hidden his proof before? The answer is, of course, yes. For example, Prophet Khidr, peace and blessings be upon him, alive, present, hidden from the sight of most people for centuries, perhaps millennia. Then you have Prophet Yunus, Jonah, peace and blessings be upon him, swallowed by the whale, hidden from his people, returned by God when the time was right. You have the people of the cave, known as the seven sleepers in the Christian tradition. The young believers described and spoken of by God in Surah Al-Kahf, the chapter of the cave, the 18th chapter of the Quran, who fled persecution and were hidden by God for more than 300 years and then awakened. You have Prophet Moses, Musa, peace and blessings be upon him, hidden from Pharaoh as an infant, raised in the house of his enemy, revealed as God's proof only when the time was right. These are not Shia stories. These are Quranic narrations, accepted by every Muslim and many of them by Christians and Jews also. Shaykh al-Saduq was saying to the doubters, the God, the same God who hid Khidr, who hid Jonah in the belly of the whale, who hid the seven sleepers for more than 3 centuries, this same God has hidden his proof in our time. The precedent is not Shia theology, the precedent is the Quran itself. And alongside these Quranic arguments, he marshaled hadith from the Prophet and from the Imams that had predicted the occultation long before it occurred. He demonstrated that the ghaiba, the occultation, was not an improvisation, it was foretold. The Imams had warned their followers, generation after generation, that a time would come when the proof would be hidden and the believers would be tested. The book was written, at least in part, in Naishapur, the very city where he had found the community in crisis. He wrote it where the wound was at its deepest. But Shaykh al-Saduq was not only a theologian, he was also a jurist. And his second great contribution was not a defense of doctrine, but a gift to the everyday believer. A book known as Man la yahdhuruhu al-Faqih, for he who has no access to a jurist. Think about that title again. This is the second of the 4 books, what we call Kutub Arba'ah, one of the 4 foundational pillars of the entire Shia Hadith canon. And its title is an act of compassion. It was written for a believer in Fergana in Iraq, in the remote villages of Central Asia. The believer who had no access to a learned scholar, no seminary nearby, no one to ask about the rules of praying or fasting or inheritance or commerce and so on. Shaykh al-Saduq compiled the essential hadith of practical law and organized them so that an ordinary person, not a specialist, not a student of the Hawza, but an everyday Muslim trying to live a correct and righteous life, could find what they needed. It was written, according to the sources, in Iraq, near what is present-day Tashkent, during one of his journeys to the furthest edges of the Shi'i world. The spirit of this book, empowering the layperson with authentic knowledge, is one of the most radical ideas in the history of Islamic scholarship. It says, you do not need to be a scholar in order to live a righteous life. You just need access to the words of the Imams, organized with care and transmitted with honesty. And if no scholar can come to you, then this book will stand in his place. Now, Shaykh al-Saduq's work was made possible, in part, by a political transformation that itself was a consequence of the very persecution we traced in our previous session. To understand this, we must go back to the mountains. The Daylamites were an Iranian people from the highlands of Daylam, the rugged, mountainous region south of the Caspian Sea, in what is today the province of Gilan in northern Iran. Their mountains were so remote, so difficult to penetrate, that they were amongst the last people in Iran to be reached by the Arab Muslim conquests. While the great cities of Persia, Isfahan, Ray, Shiraz, fell relatively quickly, the Daylamites held out for centuries, maintaining their independence through sheer geography and a fierce warrior culture. They were renowned as foot soldiers, heavily armed infantry, who fought with swords, shields, and a distinctive double-pronged spear, forming shield walls that even cavalry struggled to break. For a very long time, the Daylamites were not Muslim at all. Many remained Zoroastrian. Some of them had been exposed to Christianity, and their mountains had never been fully administered by any of the caliphates. But then something happened that changed the trajectory of these people forever. During the reign of Harun Abbasi, the same Harun Rashid people call him, the same Abbasid Khalif who imprisoned Imam al-Kadhim in the dungeons, as we discussed in our last session and also in depth in our Imam Kazim session, who persecuted Shia Muslims began fleeing from the Abbasid heartlands. And where do the persecuted flee? To the places the persecutor cannot reach. They fled to places like Daylam. Among the refugees were descendants of Ahlul Bayt themselves, known as alids, members of the Prophet's family, carrying with them their faith, their grief, and their love for the Imams. These refugees settled among the Daylamite mountain people and began gradually to share their beliefs. The Daylamites, who had resisted the Caliphate politically, found in Shi'ism a faith that shared their resistance. A faith that said the Caliphs are usurpers. The true authority belongs to the family of the Prophet. Justice has been denied. One day justice will return. Over the course of the 9th and 10th centuries, the Daylamites embraced Shi'ism, and first Zaydism, and eventually for many years, Twelver Shi'ism. And from these mountains, a dynasty would emerge, the Buyid dynasty. This was founded by 3 brothers, Ali, Hassan, and Ahmed, the sons of a man named Buya. Historical sources describe their father as a fisherman, a man of humble origins from these very mountains. The brothers rose through military service, first under the Daylamite warlord, known as Mahdawiyyah ibn Ziyar, and then independently conquering one province after another. Ali took Fars, the Fars province, and established himself in Shiraz. Hassan took the central Iranian provinces and made Rey his capital, the provinces nowadays known as Markazi. And the Abbasid Khalif, unable to resist, conferred upon them the honorific titles Imad al-Dawla, the pillar of the state, to Ali, Rukn al-Dawla, the foundation of the state, to Hassan, and Mu'iz al-Dawla, the fortifier of the state, to Ahmed. And in 334 years after Hijrah, Ahmed, who is now known as Mu'iz al-Dawla, the fortifier of the state, marched into Baghdad itself. He did not overthrow the Khalif, the Abbasid Khalif. He did something far more devastating. Within months, he discovered that the sitting Khalif was plotting against him. His response, Mu'iz al-Dawla's response, was swift and humiliating. He sent 2 Daylamite officers to seize the Khalif, who was dragged from his residence. The Khalif was known as al-Mustakfi billah, who was dragged from his residence, thrown into prison, and blinded. In his place, Mu'iz al-Dawla installed someone called Muti' lillah, a compliant figurehead, who held the title of Khalif but answered entirely to the Buyid commander. From that day forward, the Abbasid Khalifs fully obeyed the Buyids. The Caliphate continued in name, but real power belonged to the sons of the fishermen from the mountains. And here's why this matters for what we're talking about, our story. The Buyids remembered where they came from. They remembered the Alid refugees, the Shi'i refugees, who had brought Islam to their mountains. They remembered the Shi'i faith that had given meaning to their resistance. And when they came to power, they did not persecute the followers of Ahlul Bayt, rather they protected them. Under Buyid patronage, for the first time in the history of Baghdad, the mourning ceremonies for Imam Hussein, peace and blessings be upon him, were held publicly. In 352 years after Hijrah, Mu'iz al-Dawla ordered that the day of Ashura be observed as a day of public mourning. Markets were closed, lamentation processions filled the streets, and the community was free to grieve openly for the master of the martyrs. The celebration of Eid al-Ghadir, the anniversary of the Prophet's declaration at Ghadir, was also observed publicly for the first time. The intellectual consequences of this were equally profound. Under Buyid rule, Shia scholars could teach openly, they could debate publicly, publish freely, and build institutions for the first time without fear of state persecution. The first formal Twelver Shi'i institution of higher learning was established in Baghdad. It was called al-Adudiyyah. It was established in Baghdad in 362 after Hijrah by the Buyid ruler Adud al-Dawla. It came complete with student housing and an endowment, what we know as a waqf. The great library in the Al-Kharq quarter of Baghdad, the Shia neighborhood, hosted over 100 bookshops. Debate sessions were held in courts, in mosques, in gardens, and in markets. It was the most intellectually vibrant period in Islamic history. And it was made possible because the sons of mountain fishermen remembered the refugees who once sought shelter in their valleys. Shaykh al-Saduq himself had a direct relationship with the Buyid rulers. Rukn al-Dawla, who governed Ray, the portion that is currently Tehran, the city that became Shaykh al-Saduq's base, respected him deeply, invited him to court, seated him beside himself in gatherings, and asked him to pray for him at the shrine of Imam al-Rida in Mashhad. Shaykh al-Saduq himself records, and this is in the introduction of one of his books, Uyun Akhbar al-Rida. You can find the reference in the write-up. He writes, "When I sought permission from the prosperous or felicitous Amir Rukn al-Dawla to visit the shrine of Imam al-Rida in Mashhad, peace and blessings be upon him, he granted me permission for that in Rajab of the year 352. But as I turned to leave him, he called me back and said to me, 'This is a blessed shrine. I have visited it and asked God Almighty for needs that were in my soul, and he fulfilled them for me. So do not fall short in praying for me there and visiting on my behalf, for indeed supplication there is answered.' So I guaranteed that for him and I fulfilled it." This was a golden window. Like the Sadiqiyya window we discussed in our previous session, when the chaos between the Umayyad collapse and the Abbasid consolidation gave Imam al-Sadiq space and time to teach, the Buyid window gave Shaykh al-Saduq and the scholars who would follow him, people like Shaykh al-Mufid, Sayyid Murtada, Shaykh Tusi and others, the space to build. But golden windows do not last long. Within a century, the Seljuk Turks would sweep in from Central Asia, destroy the Shi'a institutions of Baghdad, burn the libraries and close the windows with fire and sword. This is the subject of a future session. The pattern by now is familiar. Seize the window. Build while you can, and build well enough that what you construct survives the closing. And the lessons for our time from Shaykh Saduq. 3 things we carry from Shaykh Saduq tonight. First, he went to the people. He did not wait for them to come to Qom. He traveled to Nishapur, to Balkh, to Samarkand, to Fergana, because he heard they were struggling and he believed that the scholar's duty was to go where the need was the greatest. In our age, this diaspora is the new Nishapur. Today, there are Shia communities in Rochdale, in London, in Dearborn, in Sydney, in Sao Paulo, in anywhere. Communities that are struggling with the same questions. Shaykh al-Saduq's audiences struggled with, is this real? Is this relevant? Does any of this matter in the modern world? The answer is the same as Shaykh Saduq's answer. Go to them. Meet them where they are. Bring the knowledge to the people, not the people to the knowledge. Second, the doubt he addressed. Is the Imam really there? Is the same doubt that faces every generation in a different form. In Shaykh al-Saduq's time it was, is the occultation real? In our time it takes a different shape. Is Islam relevant? Is religion itself real? Does God exist? Is the tradition we've inherited worth preserving? Shaykh al-Saduq's method, combining rational argument with transmitted proof, drawing on the Quran on historical precedent, meeting doubt with evidence rather than condemnation, remains the model. He did not curse the doubters, he answered them. Third, Man la yahduruhu al-Faqih, a book for those who have no access to a scholar. In our age of internet fatwa, social media confusion, and self-appointed authorities who issue rulings without any qualification, the spirit of this book is needed more now than ever. But let us be clear about something. We are not orphans. The everyday believer deserves access to authentic, verified, carefully organized knowledge. And in our time, that access exists. We have the Maraja. We have the institution of the Marja'iyyah that this entire series is tracing. And we have the Wali al-Faqih, the guardian jurist, who stands at the supreme point of reference for the community in the absence of the Imam. Following the martyrdom of Imam Sayyid Ali Khamenei, may God bless his pure soul, That station is now held by Imam Sayyid Mujtaba Khamenei. May God protect him and grant him strength. The infrastructure of guidance is not theoretical, it is real and it is alive. And in our own humble efforts, us as the Truth Promoters Group, we are working to make this access even more practical and immediate. Through platforms such as Ilm Flow, designed to bring structured Islamic learning to believers wherever they are, and Fiqh Flow, designed to connect the everyday believer with verified jurisprudential guidance from the righteous Maraja. We are trying in our small way to honor the spirit of what Shaykh al-Saduq built. A book for those who have no direct access to a scholar. A system for those who need guidance and cannot travel to Qom or Najaf in order to find it. But tools and platforms are not enough on their own. They need scholars behind them. And this brings us to a message that must be said clearly to the students of the Hawza, and especially those from the collective West, from Britain, Europe, North America, Australia, Canada. The Quran itself defines the purpose of religious study, and it does not end with the studying. In Quran, Surah Tawbah, the chapter of the repentance, 9th chapter of the Quran, verse 122, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala says, "And it is not for the believers to go forth all at once. Rather, from every division, every group of them, a group should go forth to obtain understanding in the religion, and to warn their people when they return to them, that they might be cautious." Think about that verse very carefully. It does not say, go and study and remain over there. It says, go and study. لِيَتَفَقَّهُوا فِي الدِّينِ. Obtain deep understanding in the religion, and warn their people when they return to them. When they return, not if, when. The purpose of the Hawza, as we established in session 61, is not merely to produce scholars. It is to produce human beings. Human beings who have confronted their egos, who have sat at the feet of the masters, who have breathed the air of Najaf or Qom, who have been transformed by that process. And then, and this is the part that too often is forgotten, those human beings must come back. They must return to their communities in London, Rochdale, Leicester, Dearborn, Sydney, Toronto, Jakarta, wherever. They must do what Shaykh al-Saduq did. Go to the people. Shaykh al-Saduq did not stay in Qom. He did not build a comfortable life in Ray and write books for other scholars to read. He traveled to Naishapur because the people of Naishapur were in doubt. He traveled to Fergana because the people of Fergana had no scholar. He wrote Man La Yahdhur al-Faqih, a book for the one who has no access to a jurist, because he understood that knowledge locked in a seminary is knowledge that has failed its purpose. That is what Shaykh al-Saduq gave to the believers of Fergana in the 4th century. It is what we owe to the believers of the 21st. Please give me a loud salawat, and we go to the final point, which is the architecture of preservation, the 4 books and the 6 books, and the struggle for clarification. So, we've met 2 of the builders tonight, Shaykh al-Kulayni and Shaykh al-Saduq. Their works form the first 2 pillars of what the tradition calls al-Kutub al-Arba'ah, the 4 books, the canonical hadith collections upon which the entire edifice of Shia jurisprudence, theology and spiritual life rests. Let us name them together because they belong together. Firstly, you have Al-Kafi, the Sufficient, by Shaykh al-Kulayni. Over 16,000 narrations compiled across 20 years in Baghdad. The most comprehensive collection of hadith from the Imams ever assembled. We've heard its story this evening. Second, Man La Yahdhur al-Faqih, for he who has no access to a jurist, by Shaykh al-Saduq. A practical legal manual for the everyday believer, written in Iraq near present-day Tashkent, at the edge of the known Shi'i world. We've also heard its story tonight. Third, Tahzib al-Ahkam, the refinement of rulings by Shaykh Tusi. A systemic legal compendium that resolved contradictions between hadith and organized the jurisprudential tradition into a coherent system. We will learn about this in future sessions. Fourth, you have al-Istibsar, the discernment, also by Shaykh Tusi, a companion work to the Tahzib, focused specifically on cases where narrations appeared to contradict each other, providing methods for resolving the apparent conflict. We will meet Shaykh Tusi, the man who completed the 4 books and founded the Hawza of Najaf, in a future session, as I've said, God willing. But his works belong here, named alongside Shaykh al-Kulayni and Shaykh al-Saduq, because the 4 pillars hold up a single roof. These 4 books were built upon the foundations of Usul Arba'umi'ah, the 400 principles, the original notebooks compiled by direct companions of the Imams, personal records of what those companions heard directly from the living proofs of God. Shaykh al-Kulayni was the first to systematically gather, classify, evaluate these scattered notebooks into a unified, organized work, of course, Al-Kafi. Without the usul, the principles, there would be no 4 books. And without the 4 books, there would be no marja'iyah, because there would be nothing for a marja' to derive their rulings from. The act of completion was itself an act of construction. And we were not alone in this race, as I've said. At virtually the same time, in the same century, driven by the same urgency, our brethren of the Sunnah were completing their own monumental effort of codification. The entire Muslim world, Shi'i and Sunni alike, were engaged in a race against time, driven by the same fear that the living links to the prophetic generation were fading, and what was not written would be lost. The Sunni Hadith canon is known as Al-Kutub al-Sittah, the 6 books. Let us name them because, like with the Kutub al-Arba'ah, they deserve to be known, not as our rivals, not as rivals to our canon, but as a parallel expression of the same devotion to preserving the words of the Prophet, peace and blessings be upon him, his family and his righteous companions. So first you have Sahih al-Bukhari, compiled by Abu Abdullah Muhammad bin Ismail al-Bukhari. He was born in Bukhara in what is today's Uzbekistan, a Persian Muslim like many of the greatest scholars of Islam. Al-Bukhari reportedly examined some 600,000 narrations and selected approximately 7,500 that met his rigorous criteria for authenticity. It is the most revered collection of hadith in Sunni Islam. He spent 16 years traveling across the Muslim world, Iraq, the Hijaz, Egypt, the Levant, gathering and verifying. He completed his work around 232 years after Hijrah, and he died near Samarkand. His dedication to precision was legendary. It is said that he would not record a single hadith without first performing the ritual ablution wudu and praying 2 units of prayer. Second, Sahih al-Muslim, compiled by Muslim ibn al-Hajjaj al-Nayshaburi. He was born in Nayshabur, the very city where a generation later Shaykh al-Saduq would find the Shia community in crisis. Muslim reviewed some 300,000 narrations and selected approximately 7,500 for his collection. Together with Sahih al-Bukhari, the 2 are referred to as the Sahihain, the 2 Sahihs, and are regarded by the Sunni tradition as the most authentic sources after the Quran. Third, you have Sunan Abu Dawud, compiled by Abu Dawud as-Sijistani, a collection focused on legal hadith containing approximately 4,800 narrations. Number 4, you have Jami' al-Tirmidhi, compiled by Abu Isa Muhammad al-Tirmidhi, notable for its inclusion of the compiler's own assessment of each hadith's strength, an early form of critical evaluation, if you like. Number 5, you have Sunan al-Nasa'i, compiled by Abu Abdurrahman Ahmed al-Nasa'i, known for its particularly strict criteria of narrator evaluation. And number 6, Sunan ibn Majah, compiled by Abu Abdullah Muhammad ibn Yazid ibn Majah al-Qazwini, the last of the 6 to gain canonical status. These scholars were driven by the same urgency as Shaykh al-Kulayni and Shaykh al-Saduq. Their labor was intense and immense. Their sincerity was real. Their contribution to Islamic civilization is undeniable. Al-Bukhari spent 16 years on his collection. Shaykh al-Kulayni spent 20. Muslims scrutinized 300,000 narrations. Shaykh al-Saduq traveled from Qom to Fergana gathering his. The methods certainly differed, the schools differed, but the impulse was the same. Preserve what the Prophet brought before the living memory of it is gone. And here is a detail worth pursuing and pausing on. Look at where these scholars came from. Al-Bukhari from Bukhara, Muslim from Naishapur, At-Tirmidhi from Termez, Ibn Majah from Qazwin, Shaykh al-Kulayni from Kulayn near Shahrarayn, near Ray, Shaykh al-Saduq from Qom. These are not Arab cities. These are not Arab cities. These are Iranian and Central Asian cities, Bukhara, Naishapur, Termez, Qazwin, Qom, Ray. The preservation of the Prophet's tradition, Sunni and Shia alike, was carried out overwhelmingly by non-Arab Muslims, by those known as the Mawali that we mentioned in the previous session, by converts and their descendants who loved the Prophet's message so deeply that they dedicated their lives to ensuring not a word of it was lost as far as they could. The tree is one. The branches diverged in methodology and in doctrine, but the roots, the love for the Prophet, the urgency of the preservation, the willingness to spend a lifetime in service of a single book, these roots are certainly shared. We have now named the two canons, 4 books and 6 books, side by side. And in naming them together, we have honored a shared inheritance. But here is where the paths diverge. And the divergence is not minor, it is foundational. It shapes everything that follows, how each tradition relates to its scholars, how it handles doubt, how it remains alive across the centuries. In the Sunni tradition, the two Sahihs, Bukhari and Muslim, came to occupy a position of extraordinary authenticity. The title Sahih itself, meaning sound, authentic, correct, was understood over time to apply not merely to individual narrations within the collections, but to the collections as a whole. The great Sunni scholar An-Nanawi, he wrote, and the reference of course is in the write-up, the scholars, may God have mercy on them, have agreed that the most authentic books after the Noble Quran are the two Sahihs, Bukhari and Muslim, and the Ummah has received them with acceptance. This is not a fringe position. It is the mainstream Sunni view held across centuries. While individual Sunni scholars have always maintained the theoretical right to question specific narrations, the practical reality is that the Sahihain, Muslim and Bukhari, came to be treated with something approaching sacral reverence. Collections whose overall authenticity is not to be questioned. We say this not to criticize, we say it to draw a contrast, because the Shia approach is fundamentally different. In the Shia tradition, no book, except Quran, not even Al-Kafi, is considered Sahih in its entirety. Let that settle. The most magnificent book in the Shia canon, the book that Shaykh al-Mufid called the most magnificent of the books of the Shia and the most beneficial, the book that Shahid Awwal said, the like of which has not been produced for the Imamiyyah, is not treated as wholly authentic. Every individual hadith within it must be evaluated by qualified scholars. The book is a repository. It is not a verdict. The verdict belongs to the scholar who examines each narration against multiple criteria. The great marja of the 20th century, Ayatollah Sayyid Abul Qasim al-Khoi, may God rest his pure soul, stated this with characteristic clarity. He said, and he wrote one of the biggest books of Rijal that are biographies of the people who narrated the hadith. He wrote right at the beginning of this book, in the introduction, he wrote, the conclusion is that the authenticity of all the narrations of Al-Kafi has not been established. Indeed, there is no doubt that some of them are weak and some of them, one can be confident, were not issued by the infallible, peace and blessings be upon them. This is not a radical position. This is not some modern revisionism. This is the mainstream Shi'i view. And it has been the mainstream view from the very beginning. Shaykh al-Kulayni himself, as we heard in his introduction, said, whatever shortcoming there may be in it, acknowledging before anyone else could that his work was a human effort subject to human limitations. Now, why does this matter? Because it keeps the tradition alive. If a book is settled, if its contents are beyond question, then what you need are librarians, people to preserve, to copy, and to distribute. Important work, certainly, but static work. But if every hadith in every book must be individually evaluated, if no collection, however revered, is beyond scrutiny, then what you need are mujtahids, living scholars, minds that are trained, qualified, and authorized to examine, to weigh, and to judge. You need an entire system of scholarly authority, teachers and students, verification and debate, qualification and accountability. You need, in other words, a hawza, a marja'iyya. The Shia insistence that no book is wholly sahih is not skepticism. It is not disrespect for the compilers. It is the very engine that keeps a scholarly tradition in motion, because it means that the work is never finished. Every generation must engage with the text anew. Every marja must exercise his own judgment. The tradition does not fossilize because it is never allowed to settle into the comfort of unquestioned authority. And this principle, the insistence on perpetual verification, did not emerge from thin air. It was taught by the Imams themselves. So, what is the standard by which a hadith is to be evaluated? The Imams gave the answer, and the answer is remarkably and devastatingly simple, and it's devastatingly demanding. Imam Ja'far al-Saduq, peace and blessings be upon him, established what the scholars call the principle of presenting the hadith to the Quran. You can find in al-Kulayni, in Al-Kafi, a hadith from Imam Sadiq which says, whatever is in agreement with the book of God, accept it, and whatever is contrary to it, reject it. And in a related narration, Imam Sadiq was even more direct. He said, and the references to all of these are in the write-up, everything is returned to the book and the sunnah, and every hadith that does not accord with the book of God is mere embellishment. Now the word he uses is zukhruf. The Imam's choice of language here is not accidental, it's Quranic. In Surah Al-An'am, the chapter of the cattle, 6th chapter of the Quran, in verse 112, Allah describes the method of the enemies of every prophet. He says, and thus we have made for every prophet an enemy, devils from among mankind and jinn, inspiring one another with zukhruf al-qawl, decorated speech, as a delusion. Zukhruf al-qawl, decorated speech, adorned words, falsehoods made so beautiful so that it deceives the one who hears it. The Quran is telling us that this is the weapon of Satan, not crude lies that anyone can detect, but speech that has been decorated, polished, made to look and sound like truth, so that even sincere people are taken in. And when Imam al-Sadiq says that a hadith contradicting the book of God is zukhruf, he is deliberately reaching for this Quranic term. He's saying a fabricated hadith is not merely an error. It is the very thing the Quran warned us about, the decorated speech of those who oppose the prophets. It looks like religion, sounds like religion, it is dressed in the clothing of religion, but it contradicts the book of God, and therefore it is zukhruf, ornamentation, deception, the whispering of Satan made to look like sacred tradition. This is why the Imam's instruction, present every hadith to the Quran. is not merely a scholarly methodology, it is a Quranic defense. The Quran itself warned the enemies of the prophets would produce beautiful, decorated speech designed to mislead. We see this in the media today. And the Imam gave us an antidote. Test everything against the book. What agrees, take it. What contradicts, leave it, no matter how beautifully it is dressed. And a narration from Imam Ali, peace and blessings be upon him, transmitted through Imam al-Baqir and Imam al-Saduq, peace and blessings be upon them, deepens this principle even further. Imam Ali says, pausing at a matter of doubt is better than plunging into destruction. Your leaving a hadith that you have not verified is better than your narrating a hadith that you have not mastered. Verily, upon every truth there is a reality, and above every right thing there is a light. Whatever accords with the book of God, take it, and whatever contradicts the book of God, leave it. The reference again is in the write-up. Look at Imam Ali's words again, a little bit slowly. Pausing as a matter of doubt is better than plunging into destruction. This is not the language of a tradition that wants you to accept things blindly. This is the language of a tradition that demands caution, precision, and intellectual courage and discernment. The Imam is saying, if you're not sure, stop. Do not narrate that which you have not verified. Do not transmit what you have not mastered. Upon every truth there is a reality, and above every right thing there is a light. This is a test. Does the narration carry the light of truth? And the standard against which that light is measured is the Book of God. Whatever accords with the Book of God, take it. And whatever contradicts it, leave it. The hadith, the Quran rather, is the touchstone. A hadith that contradicts the Quran, no matter how prestigious the collection it appears in, must be set aside. The Book of God is the supreme criterion. And lest anyone think these warnings are theoretical, that the Imams were guarding against some sort of hypothetical threat, the history of hadith shows us otherwise. There is a phenomenon well known in the science of hadith called al-Isra'iliyat. Narrations that entered the Islamic hadith and tafsir tradition from Jewish, Christian, or Zoroastrian sources. Sometimes these entered innocently through early converts from the people of the book, people like a couple of names, Ka'b ibn Ahbar and Wahab ibn Munabih. These are narrators who brought with them the stories and traditions of their former faith, and whose narrations about the prophets were eagerly received by a community hungry for detail on the Quran. In its characteristic conciseness, the Quran had chosen not to give us so much detail. People were very interested in detail, even today. Sometimes they entered through storytellers. These Isra'iliyat entered through storytellers who had discovered their audiences loved the elaborate, detailed narrative of the biblical tradition, for example. Tales about the lives of the prophets that were far more colorful and dramatic than what the Quran offered. And sometimes they were injected deliberately. Fabrications designed to confuse, corrupt, or to import ideas into Islam that had no basis in revelation. These narrators found their way into tafsir works, into hadith collections, and into the popular imagination of the Muslim community, both Sunni and Shia alike. In the Shi'i tradition, the challenge of Isra'iliyat is particularly visible in the great encyclopedic collection of Bihar al-Anwar, the Sea of Lights, compiled by Allama Muhammad Baqir al-Majlisi in around 1699 of the Common Era in about 110 volumes. And we will cover Shaykh Allama Majlisi in a future session. Allama Majlisi's project was different to Shaykh al-Kulayni and Shaykh al-Saduq's. He was not selecting and filtering, he was just collecting, gathering narrations from every available source, including many that had been scattered, forgotten, or housed in private libraries across the Shi'i world. His goal was preservation, not certification. The result is a vast ocean of material, some of it of the highest authenticity, and some of it carrying the unmistakable fingerprints of Israeliyat, stories about the prophets that echo the biblical tradition more than the Quranic one, narrations whose content sits uncomfortably with established Islamic principles, material that found its way into Shia sources through the same channels that introduced it into Sunni sources. This is not a criticism of Allama Majlisi. His work of preservation was heroic and necessary. It is a vindication of the principle the Imams taught. The ocean he gathered needs the filter the Imams provided. Without the discipline of presenting every narration to the Quran, even the most sincere collection becomes a mixture of gold and tinsel or fool's gold, of truth and zukhruf. This is why the principle is not academic, it is not historical. It is alive and it has work to do in every generation, in every collection, in every narration a scholar encounters. Now, and this is where I ask the audience to lean in. The Imam's instruction sounds simple. Test the hadith against the Quran. Accept what agrees, reject what contradicts. But it is not simple at all, because it presupposes something enormous. It presupposes that you understand the Quran. And this is where the Imam's seemingly simple instruction opens the door into an entire universe of scholarship. Because the Quran, while it is clear in guidance, while it describes itself as a light and a clarification, it is not a book that yields all its meanings on a first reading. It contains verses that are muhkam, clear and unambiguous, and verses that are mutashabih, allegorical, layered, requiring interpretation. It contains legal rulings that are stated in general terms and require specification. It contains narratives that are concise and require context. It contains language of extraordinary depth, words that carry multiple dimensions of meaning, sentences whose grammar opens into different possible readings, passages whose full significance only becomes clear in light of other passages. This is not a deficiency, it is by design. God says in the Quran in Surah An-Nahl, the chapter of the bee, 16th chapter of the Quran, verse 89, He says, "And we have sent down to you the book as a tibyan, a clarification of all things, and as guidance and mercy and glad tidings for those who submit." Tibyan likulli shay, a clarification of all things. Not some things, all things. And here is the question that the verse itself raises. If the Quran is a clarification of all things, then why do we need hadith? Why do we need scholars? Why do we need an entire tradition of interpretation? The answer is that the Quran clarifies all things, but not all of its clarifications are immediately accessible to every reader. The Quran is like a vast ocean. Its surface is visible to all, but its depths require one to dive deep. And the science of diving into the Quran, of drawing out its meanings, of understanding its layers, of connecting its verses to one another and to the lived reality of the community, this is a science called tafsir. The word tafsir literally means to uncover, to explain, and to make clear. It is the discipline through which the qualified scholars engage with the text of the Quran and draw out its meanings. And it's not a free-for-all. It is a rigorous, disciplined science with its own rules, its own methodologies, and its own qualifications. Think of it this way. In the Christian tradition, the discipline of interpreting scripture is called hermeneutics, and it is one of the oldest and most sophisticated fields of Christian scholarship. The great theologians of Christianity, Augustine, Aquinas, Luther, Calvin, all understood that scripture requires interpretation, and that interpretation requires method, training, and accountability. The text does not interpret itself. Someone must engage with it. In the scientific tradition, every claim, no matter how brilliant, must undergo peer review. A scientist publishes his findings. Other scientists examine them, test them, challenge them, replicate them. Knowledge advances not through individual genius alone, but through the communal process of verification. No one's findings are accepted simply because of who they are. The work must be tested. Tafsir operates on a very similar logic. The Quran is the supreme text, but the understanding of the Quran is a human activity. And human activities require methodology, qualification, and accountability. A scholar of tafsir must know the Arabic language at the deepest level, its grammar, its morphology, its rhetorical structures, its pre-Islamic poetry. He must know the circumstance of revelation, what we call asbab al-nuzul, why and when each verse was revealed. He must know the hadith tradition, when the Prophet and the Imams said what they said about a given verse, and he must have the ability to verify said hadith. He must know the principles of jurisprudence, he must know logic, he must know the opinions of previous scholars, and he must be a person of piety, because the Quran does not open its secrets to the arrogant. And this imperative to understand, to verify, to sift truth from falsehood is not merely an academic exercise. It is a jihad. The martyr, Imam Sayyid Ali Khamenei, may God bless his pure soul, spoke extensively about the concept of tabyin, clarification. The Ahlul Bayt and the righteous scholars who followed them did not merely teach the truth exists. They taught that truth must be struggled for, that falsehood does not announce itself as falsehood. It comes dressed as truth, as zukhruf, as decorated speech. And therefore the believer, and especially the scholar, he has a duty, a jihad, to clarify, to sift the false from the true, to expose the decorated lies, and to make the truth unmistakably clear for the people. And this is what we call for in our work on the subject of tabyin, the subject of a dedicated series, because we felt it deserved sustained attention in its own right, and we will revisit that subject. But the roots of tabyin are here, in the very principle we've been discussing this evening. The Imam said, present the hadith to the Quran. That act of presenting, of testing, examining, verifying, is itself an act of tabyin. It is the refusal to accept the surface of things. It is the insistence on clarity. And it is a duty that never ends. That series takes its name from this very verse, from Surah An-Nahl, the chapter of the bee, 16th chapter of the Quran, verse 89. And we have sent down to you the book as a tabyin, a clarification of all things, and as a guidance and a mercy and glad tidings for those who submit. A clarification of all things. The Quran clarifies, but the process by which we access that clarification, the process of tabyin, of making clear, is a science, a discipline, and a lifelong pursuit. And here is how it connects to everything that we've discussed tonight. Let us now stand back a little bit and see what has been built. We began this evening with scattered notebooks, the raw material of the prophetic tradition dispersed across the Shi'i world. We watched Shaykh al-Kulayni gather them into Al-Kafi. We watched Shaykh al-Saduq travel to the edges of the known Shi'a world to preserve, defend, and distribute the knowledge of the Imams. Together with the later works of Shaykh al-Tusi, the Tahdhib and Istibsar, they gave us the 4 books. But the 4 books were not the end, they were the beginning, because the Imam did not say, take whatever is in the books and follow it. They said, test it, present it to the Quran, reject what contradicts, accept what accords. And when you encounter doubt, pause. Do not plunge into your own destruction. Verify before you submit. And to do that, to test hadith against Quran, you must first understand the Quran. And to understand the Quran, you must master tafsir. And to master tafsir, you must spend years, decades in study. Arabic, logic, jurisprudence, hadith sciences, history, philosophy, theology, spirituality, etc. You must sit at the feet of masters. You must be tested and found qualified. You must be authorized, not by a certificate, but by the recognition of your peers and your teachers that you have reached the capacity to exercise independent judgment or ijtihad. Do you see what has happened? The act of compiling hadith created the need for evaluating the hadith. The principle of testing the hadith against the Quran created the need for understanding the Quran. The science of tafsir created the need for qualified interpreters. And the requirement for qualified interpreters created the need for an entire institutional system of training, evaluation, and authorization. That system is the Marja'iyah and the Hawza. Without the 4 books, there is nothing to derive rulings from. Without the principle of measuring against the Quran, there is no standard by which to evaluate. Without tafsir, there is no capacity to understand the Quran against which everything is measured. Without the insistence that no book is wholly sahih, that every narration must be individually assessed, there is no need for living scholars. And without the need for living scholars, there is no hawza to train them and no marja'iyah to channel their authority. The compilation of the hadith was not merely an act of preservation, it was an act of construction. The preservers were building something, whether they knew it or not. They were laying the foundations of a system that would sustain the community through centuries of occultation. A system of living scholarly authority, rooted in transmitted knowledge, tested against the Quran, exercised by qualified individuals, and renewed in every generation. The architecture of guidance. This is what Shaykh al-Kulayni and Shaykh al-Saduq built. And this is what Shaykh al-Tusi would complete. And that is what the community lives within to this day. In the rulings of the Maraji, in the guidance of the Wali al-Faqih, in the ongoing, never finished work of understanding what God has revealed and what the Imams have transmitted. The building is not complete. It will not be complete until the Imam himself returns in order to complete it. But the foundations are sound, and they were laid by the men we have met tonight, in the silence of the occultation, by candlelight, one narration at a time. Please give me a salawat and we move to the conclusion and the key takeaways. So tonight we walked through the first phase of the architecture of guidance, the phase that we call the preservers. Of course, we began with a letter, the Tawqi of the Hidden Imam, delegating authority to the scholars who would carry the community through the silence of the occultation. We met 2 men who answered that call. Shaykh al-Kulayni, the man from Kulayn, who spent 20 years in Baghdad compiling over 16,000 narrations into Al-Kafi, the sufficient, completing his life's work at the exact moment the door of the minor occultation closed. A man who heard a community's cry for guidance and answered it with a book that would outlast empires. Then you have Shaykh al-Saduq, the child born of the Imam's own supplication, who traveled from Qom to Fargana, from Ray to Samarkand, and who found the community in doubt and answered doubt not with condemnation, but with evidence and compassion. A man who wrote Man la yahdharuhu al-Faqih, a book for one who has no access to a jurist, because he believed that no believer should be left without guidance, no matter how far they live from the centers of learning. We place their work alongside the Kutub al-Sittah, honoring the parallel efforts of our Sunni brethren. And we drew the critical distinction in our tradition: no book is wholly sahih. Every narration must be tested, and the standard against which it is tested is the Book of God, the principle of measure against the Quran, taught by the Imams themselves. We heard the Imams say, whatever accords with the Book of God, take it. Whatever contradicts it, leave it. And we heard him call a hadith that contradicts the Quran, zukhruf, the very word the Quran uses for decorated speech of the enemies of the prophets. And we followed the thread to its conclusion, that this principle, test everything against Quran, presupposes that you understand the Quran. And that presupposition demands tafsir, and tafsir demands qualified scholars, and qualified scholars demand a system of training, verification, and authorization. And that system is the hawza. the institution that trains and forms the scholars, and the Marja'iyah, the authority that those scholars exercise. The one produces, the other guides. Together, they are the architecture of guidance. The compilers did not merely preserve, they built. One narration at a time, they laid the foundations of the system that sustains us to this day. 3 things to carry away with you from this tonight. Number 1, the preservation of the prophetic tradition was a race against time, and it was run by both the Shi'i and Sunni scholars, driven by the same love for the Prophet, the same urgency, and the same devotion. The tree is one, the branches diverged, but the roots are shared. Number 2, the Shia insistence that no book is wholly sahih is not skepticism. It is the engine that keeps the tradition alive, because it means the work is never finished, and every generation must engage with the text anew. It is why we need living scholars, not mere libraries. Number 3, Shaykh al-Saduq went to the people. He did not wait for the people to come to him. In our age, with the Maraji and with the al-Faqih, with platforms like Ilm Flow and Fiqh Flow, and with the Hausa students who must return one day to their communities, the duty remains the same. Go to the people. Bring the light to where the darkness is deepest. This is what the preservers did. That is what we owe. Please give me a salawat and we move to the eulogy and the supplication. The eulogy is titled The Bridge Between Two Ages. So we close tonight, as always, with remembrance. And tonight the remembrance belongs to the man with whom we began. Thiqat al-Islam, Shaykh Muhammad ibn Ya'qub al-Kulayni. He was born in a small village, Kulayn, near Ray, in the heartlands of Persia. We do not know exactly the year of his birth with certainty. We know it to be around 250 to 260 after Hijrah. We don't know exactly the details of his childhood, his family, his early years, except that he was born into a religious family. The biographical sources are sparse. He was not a man who left a trail of personal glory behind him. He left a book. He came to Baghdad, the capital of the Muslim world, the city of the Abbas al-Khalifs, the city of 1,000 scholars and 100 factions, and he sat down and he began to compile. For 20 years he gathered, he verified, he classified, he organized 16,000 narrations drawn from the scattered notebooks of the companions of the Imam, the raw, precious, fragile inheritance of a community that had been persecuted, hunted, and driven underground for generations. And he finished. He finished in the year 329 after Hijrah, the very year the door of the Minor Occultation closed forever. The year the last deputy, Ali ibn Muhammad al-Samari, received the final Tawqi and departed this world. The year the silence began. Think about the timing. Shaykh al-Kulayni completed Al-Kafi, the book that would carry the voice of the Imams through the centuries of occultation, and then he died in the same year, as if his mission had been precisely calibrated. Compile the book, complete the book, and then depart. Because the book must now do what the deputy could no longer do. Ensure that the voice of the Imam was never silenced, even when the Imam was hidden. He was the bridge between two ages, the age of the deputies, when the community could still reach the Imam through his representatives or direct representatives, and the age of the scholars, when the community would have to rely on the books, the principles, and the trained minds that the Imam had commanded them to trust. Shaykh al-Kulayni stood on that bridge. He gathered everything he could from the first stage and carried it carefully, faithfully, with 20 years of painstaking labor into the second. The scholars praised him, and Najashi called him the most trustworthy of the people in hadith and the most reliable of them. But perhaps the most fitting tribute is not any scholar's praise. It is the simple fact that the book survived. Al-Kafi survived the fall of the Buyids. It survived the Seljuk destruction. It survived the Mongol devastation. It survived centuries of persecution, war, displacement, and loss. It is still here, studied in every hawza in the world, referenced in every ruling of every marja alive in every generation. The man from Kulayn is gone, The village itself is barely remembered, but the book endures. And through the book, the voice of the Imams endures. And through that voice, the community endures. He built well. May God elevate his station. May God reward him for every narration he preserved, for every doubt he answered, for every believer who found guidance in the pages he compiled. May God place him in the company of the Imams whose words he carried. And may those Imams on the Day of Judgment testify that this man served them faithfully. We close with a prayer. O God, you who hid your proof from the eyes of the world and commanded the scholars to carry the light in his absence, bless those who carried it. Bless Shaykh al-Kulayni, Shaykh al-Saduq, Shaykh al-Tawqi, and every scholar who sat by candlelight copying a narration, verifying a chain, preserving a word that might otherwise have been lost. O God, you who promised that the earth would never be without a proof, hasten the return of our master, the Imam of our time, the one for whose sake these books were compiled, these journeys were undertaken, these lives were spent. Hasten his return and make us amongst his helpers and his servants. And O God, until that day, grant us the wisdom to follow the path the Imams laid down, to test everything against your book, to reject the zukhruf no matter how beautifully it is dressed, to seek knowledge even to the edges of the earth, and to bring it back, always to bring it back to the people who need it the most. And send your blessings upon Prophet Muhammad and the family of Prophet Muhammad, the source of every narration, the origin of every light, the purpose of every book, and hasten the victory of their cause. Amen, O Lord, sustainer of the universes. Amen, O most merciful of the merciful. Wa akhiru da'wani alhamdulillahi rabbil alameen. Wassalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh.